back here with the Watchmaker's Workshop, and we've got another Q&A episode today. We have some really good questions. Thank you for sending those in. First question I've got here is, how do I feel about secondhand prices for the watches that I make, Weiss watches? To be completely honest, I used to think more about secondhand prices, but I don't go out and look for secondhand watches anymore. I'm rarely looking at the pricing that is out there for secondhand watches. Every once in a while, I will get an email from somebody asking about a certain watch, something they're trying to pick up used. And there have been some wildly expensive watches that were 3, 4, or even 5 times what the original price was on that timepiece. That makes me feel good. But of course, that doesn't always sell for that amount. And then there are always some good deals to be had as well. Really, it could range from getting a watch for half the original price, or if it's a really rare special model, it could be 7 times the price that it originally was. But I don't think too much about secondhand pricing. I'm not out there bidding on my own watches trying to drive prices up on eBay or anything. I think it's good to have multiple ways to buy a watch. Have you ever made a special edition for a watch club? And that's a good question. I have not made a special edition for a watch club. I've made some special editions or really small runs of watches for other groups, but not for a watch-specific group or watch-specific club. Maybe in the future we'll do something like that. Are there any unique challenges to finding employees or apprentices? That is the biggest challenge in the watch industry. Finding people who are qualified and passionate about making watches. There are so few watchmakers in the US that most of them are happily doing what they want to do already. So finding someone to bring into our company is one of the biggest challenges we face. The watchmaking schools here in the US are typically less than 8 students graduating every 2 years. And you can count on one hand how many schools are graduating a class every year. So there's a really small number of qualified candidates going into watchmaking. This next question made me laugh a little bit. You're on death row. What's your last meal? And for me, that's a pretty easy answer. It would have to be tacos. Do you miss anything about Southern California? Really? I don't miss anything about Southern California. The one thing I thought I would miss was the ocean. And I've replaced that with cycling. So instead of surfing and diving, I'm out on my bicycle a lot, biking through farmlands and the woods, and enjoying a different type of outdoor fun. Have you ever done a piece unique, or will you? I have done unique pieces. I have a serial number log of every single watch I have ever made. And one of the tabs in there has the unique pieces. There's about 8 unique pieces that have been made over the last 10 years. What's next for Weiss watches? Well, we have a lot of things in the works. We have some new machines here that allow us to make some more parts in the US. So really focusing on that and doing as much as we can in this workshop. You might not necessarily see massive changes in what we're offering product-wise, but inside of that watch, there will be changes that are kind of in the background. With your waterman and surfing background, is there a chance we'll see a tide complication? There's definitely a chance that I will try to do a tied complication at some point. Growing up, I had a watch with a tied complication, and it was one of my favorite watches. I still have it today. It was a quartz watch, which I don't make quartz watches. So it's always kind of been in the back of my mind to try and recreate that watch, but with a mechanical movement. So yes, that would be a dream watch of mine to make. Is there a formula for weight or size restrictions when choosing hands for a watch? Does it depend on torque or something else? There is a little bit of engineering that goes into deciding the design of a hand on a watch. As far as hour and minute hands go, they can be pretty heavy. But when you're talking about second hands, you want to make sure that you're balancing them in a certain way. So oftentimes there's a counterbalance on the backside of the hand. And depending on the design of the hand, you may need more of a counterbalance or less of a counterbalance. And then if you're thinking about chronograph hands, where the second hand will have to jump back to zero when you hit the reset, those you really want to keep as lightweight as possible and as balanced as possible, because that action of it jumping all the way back to zero or up to 60 is very intense and hard on the watch. And a lot of times if those hands become loose, they'll kind of flop around and they won't always go back to zero. So that one, it is pretty essential to make sure that your hand is well balanced and not too heavy so that it will actually jump back nicely. There's no specific formula. It's really just keeping that thought in your mind when you're designing something. You don't want to design a very heavy or unbalanced second hand. Would you ever consider offering another dial color as a standard? It's possible. Never say never, but I like the standard options that we have now. So it's not really something that I've been thinking about. Finishing techniques. Reasons for a movement or case. I can elaborate on that a little bit. There's many traditional reasons for the way a movement will be finished. As far as a case goes, it's really just for aesthetics. You may have a watch that you're trying to make look more like a tool or like a military kind of watch, and that you might want all kind of dull or brushed surfaces. Or you might be trying to make something flashier, where you might have lots of facets that are polished in order to sparkle kind of like a diamond would. Those are really just deciding what aesthetic you're trying to create. For the movement, most of the decorations on a movement were actually designed to serve a purpose. And for things like guilloche and perlage, those we are actually raising burrs on the material. Burrs that are little hooks, just like Velcro. And when dust is inside of a watch case, it will actually be grabbed by that burr and hook onto the bridge or the main plate where these dust particles might end up. And this is so that they don't end up in the jewels of the watch where the oil needs to be. There are also blued screws. The reason the screws are blued, it's so that it does not rust. We force a blue oxidation coating onto a steel, and that will keep it from rusting, because the blue is actually a form of rust. It's just that rust, when you have a perfectly clean part and you have it at just the right temperature, will appear as a very beautiful blue color. So it's actually oxidation coating that screw. And once it has oxidation on the surface, it's much less likely that it will become rusted with an ugly orange pitting, what we think of as the standard kind of rust and oxidation for steel. There are other decorations like mirror polishing on movement parts, and these usually serve a functional purpose as well. If you have a flat spring that is under the dial side of a watch, you want it to be very smooth on the top surface, so that if it does end up touching the bottom side of the dial, it will move freely and not snag on any part of the dial, because it's a spring that will be moving back and forth to allow either a wheel to advance, like a date wheel, or any kind of calendar mechanism. So these should be really smooth on the top surface. So this is a decoration, but we have to do it for the functionality of the watch. Things like rhodium plating or gold plating that are done on a watch movement, this is to keep the brass underneath from tarnishing. If we left an uncoated brass mainplate or bridge, it would turn brown and it would tarnish. So plating it with something like gold or rhodium keeps it bright and beautiful for a long time. What watch did you wear when you got married to Whitney? And if you were to marry her again today, would you wear something different? I wore one of the first standard issue field watches when we got married, and I would wear the same exact watch. I would probably choose the newer version of it, but I would definitely wear the same watch. What brand do you consider the best and why? I don't really think there is a brand that is the best. However, I personally really like Vacheron Constantin. I like the history of the brand, and I like the company today. I like what they do, I like their designs, and I think that they have a really high level of respect for watchmaking that is modern, but also the history of watchmaking, and making sure that they keep the level of watchmaking as high as possible, just to the highest level that anyone could do. They really are working at a very high level with a very big focus on tradition and history and the watchmaking itself. So they're not producing a lot of watches. As an example, they are about 1/3 the size of Patek Philippe. So they're very small production for what would be considered a relatively large brand. When I worked and trained at Vacheron, I learned to look at some of the smallest details. Things that I never noticed in watchmaking school, things that I never noticed when I worked for Audemars Piguet. The level of detail that we are looking at in a Vacheron watch, it's something that you would never look at a watch out in a jewelry store or as a collector. You would never look at that kind of magnification detail for perfection. So seeing how perfect and how high the standards are inside of Vacheron, that was something that I wanted to try and do here with Weiss as best I can, and just keeping that extremely high level of watchmaking for everything that I do. You can always find flaws in anything that's made by a human. But if those flaws are only seen under 20 times magnification and you're still stressing over them, that's really, I consider that to be the peak of watchmaking. What are some of your favorite heritage brands, specifically in the clothing world? I think as far as heritage brands go, of course, with any heritage brand, you're going to see change, right, from what they historically were and what they are today. But I really find that I like Filson. Danner, and Patagonia. Those are brands I actually wear and can relate to, and I like their history. So yeah. Thanks for following along with our first year of the Watchmaker's Workshop. There's going to be a lot of new stuff coming this year. So please stay tuned, make sure you subscribe, and tell others about us.